From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Weston. The impeachment trial of Donald J. Trump enters its fourth day today, with the end in sight, as the president's defense lawyers now present their side of the story, but we're looking at maybe ending it as early as tomorrow. We welcome now our chief Washington correspondent, Kevin Cirilli. So what do we expect to hear from the defense today, Kevin?
Not as much as what we heard from the prosecution. And in fact, it's going to be about half the time, I'm told, from sources who are staffing up on the Capitol Hill in terms of what they're preparing for. And the former president's attorneys are really just going to lay out a constitutional argument that, number one, they say that a former president cannot be impeached because he is no longer the occupant of the White House. But secondly, they're also going to point to this notion that he in no way wanted there to be deaths that occurred on Capitol Hill. Now, all of this comes, quite frankly, as the current occupant of the Oval Office, President Biden, said just within the last 24 hours, David, that he expects one or two Republican senators to change their minds. But no one is suggesting that there will be the 17 or so that would be needed in order for there to be a conviction. In terms of where the former president his political strategy lies, I did speak with the source earlier this week who said that they remain adamant that they will make this some type of issue in a Republican primary in the 2022 and, yes, 2024 midterm elections. David?
Yeah, the question is whether one of the primary contenders will be the former president himself, Donald Trump. Thank you so much to Kevin Cirilli. He's our chief Washington correspondent. Well, the Senate may be absorbed in the impeachment trial, but over on the House side, things are full steam ahead on stimulus. We welcome now Michael Zezas. He is Morgan Stanley, head of U.S. Public Policy Research. Michael, always great to have you with us. As I say, almost every day we hear from another committee voting something out on the House side. Give us a sense of where we are on that $1.9 trillion stimulus plan.
Yeah, I mean, this is the process. The Democrats are using budget reconciliation because they've concluded that there's probably not a process that can lead to getting 60 votes and avoiding the filibuster in the Senate. And that's in some ways actually good news, because otherwise you'd have a long, drawn-out negotiation with about $1 trillion in difference between the two parties as to how to get to an endpoint here. You might lose political will over the course of that. So what you're getting instead is the Democrats are running this budget reconciliation process, which is long and painstaking and goes through multiple committees, and once it's done, the House has to go through the Senate. But yeah, I think the bottom line is, at the end of the day, we think you're going to end up with not the full $1.9 trillion bill, but haircut down to something like $1.5 trillion of stimulus out. And you're going to see this reflected in the bond market and the equity market. And then we'll pivot to discussion about the next legislative package, which we also think is going to be fiscally expansionary. So
$1.5 trillion is an awful lot of money, particularly on top of all the stimulus we've had so far. At the same time, it's $400 billion less than what President Biden's asking for. At this point, what's going to keep it from being the $1.9 trillion? Because it seems like he's just going forward with his plan.
Yeah, I think there's two constraints here that still have to come into play. One is the reconciliation process itself. And if you look at that $1.9 trillion plan, about $200 billion of it appears to be budgetary effects from raising the minimum wage. It does not seem that raising the minimum wage is something that can survive the procedure of the reconciliation process, could be found to be out of scope. So that takes some money off the table. The other constraint is, what can your most progressive member of Senate and most moderate member of the Senate Democratic Caucus agree upon? Because with 50 seats, everyone effectively has veto power. We think in that situation, the legislative power accrues to the moderates. They're the ones who, out of self-preservation, might have to take the hardest stance. With that, we think can lead to haircuts in a number of the items, including scoping down those household stimulus checks with a lower income threshold. So other than the minimum wage provision coming out, the other provisions we think just get a few haircuts, and that's what gets you down to 1.5.
Michael, you mentioned that this is only stage one in what President Biden is planning. He calls a Build Back Better plan. It comes afterwards, things like infrastructure. Some people are concerned that there's a certain amount of fiscal space, and that you use it up with this $1.9 trillion. It makes it really difficult or impossible to get to the second phase. What do you say?
Yeah, well, so I'd say politically speaking, I don't think that necessarily will apply here. So first of all, if you look at any major survey of voters on the issue of deficits, you see there's really not much of a constituency on either side of the aisle or politics driven by concerns about deficits. So politicians, I think, effectively have permission from voters if they want to do deficit expansion. And then, of course, you've got what's called the economic thought leaders in the Democratic Party who are also giving similar permission. Janet Yellen has spoken very clearly about not letting deficits constrain further spending here. Obviously, there's been some noise with her and Larry Summers, but Summers' point is still very deficit permissive. So there's a political permission narrative for Democrats to move forward on both of those points. Economically speaking, I think there's a longer tail on that, and it seems that the policymakers are willing to say, we know the Fed has the tools to fight inflation. We'd rather pick that fight or own that risk than the risk of disinflation and not getting escape velocity for the economy out of the COVID crisis.
Michael, how are we going to pay for all this? Are we just going to borrow it all, or are we going to have to pay more taxes? And if so, what taxes will they be?
Yeah, again, so I look at this from the political constraint standpoint. I think at the end of the day, there will be more taxes, but they will be insufficient to offset the spending. So what we have penciled in is about $500 or $600 billion of net new taxes we expect will be enacted later this year and start in 2022. But again, that's to offset that's only partial offset versus this $1.5 trillion that's about to be spent. And on infrastructure, we think another $1.5 trillion that'll actually be spent. And it really comes down again to the constraints of what can the most moderate Democratic senators agree to. So we think they could take the corporate rate up a couple of points. We think they can take the personal rate on higher incomes up a couple of points. We think the SALT deduction might have to come back as part of that trade. And then we think deficits basically do the rest of the work because, again, there's that permission narrative from the voters and the economic thought leaders in the party.
Okay, thank you so much to Michael Zezas. He is Morgan Stanley head of U.S. Public Policy Research. And now we want to get a check on the markets. For that, we go to Abigail Doolittle. The equity markets don't look like they're moving much, but the bond market is something different.
Yes and no, David. I would say small moves across the board, really. Bigger moves from bonds earlier today, but at this point you have yields up about 2 basis points. So not a huge backup there telling you bonds are lower. Stocks slightly higher. The S&P 500 up about 0.2%, still fighting for a new all-time high. Perhaps we'll have it today if the index can keep climbing. And of course, those stimulus hopes, a piece of it, vaccine optimism. The VIX, not surprisingly, a volatility tell is in. There's those bonds you were talking about, that 10-year yield. Yes, up 2 basis points. Earlier, though, up nearly 4 basis points. So coming in a little bit, that dollar about flat. Where we have the bigger moves, though, David, on the week, in fact, over the last 2 weeks, the Russell 2000, which is really a proxy for that reflation trade, a lot of the constituents of that index, banks and energy, a piece of that inflation idea, you have it up more than 10%. And again, a lot of that stimulus optimism that you were just talking about, and again, the vaccine as well.
Yeah, the Russell 2000 you've been warning us about. It's really extended there. Thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle for that report on the markets. Coming up, New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman is here to talk about the effect of all this monetary and fiscal stimulus on the very structure of our economy. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Pretty much everybody agrees that we're going to need more government support to get us through the economic crisis resulting from the pandemic. But what happens after we're through it? What unintended consequences might there be from the massive monetary and fiscal stimulus we've seen over the last year? Tom Friedman is a columnist for the New York Times. He has won 3 Pulitzer Prizes and is the author of several best-selling books. I'll just pick one out, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, Understanding Globalization. So, Tom, welcome to Bloomberg. Really great to have you here. Let's talk about socialism for the rich and capitalism for the rest, something you've written about now. One of the effects, perhaps, of what we've seen with the extraordinary monetary and fiscal stimulus. Explain to us how you see that developing and what the consequences might be.
Well, David, great to be with you and the Bloomberg audience. This really grew out of an interview with Rishir Sharma from Morgan Stanley and his research. And the main point is that when you basically have a government that is intervening in the economy as much as ours has, with trillions of dollars since 2008, but obviously, again, with the pandemic. You bolster the economy. You need to do that because you have this collapse in demand. But at the same time, when government's buying all of this debt, it ends up buying debt of very, very weak companies. And you get this phenomenon of zombie companies. Some people believe that 20% of companies out there are zombies in that, but for this government intervention, they really couldn't survive. What that means is that they're soaking up talent, they're soaking up capital, and that slows down innovation because the natural process of capitalism, which is like forest fires in nature, you clear out the dead wood in order for new growth to emerge, isn't happening. And that's why we've had a fall off in startups.
Yeah, as I understand, zombie companies are a company that don't throw up and don't generate enough cash even to pay their interest from year to year. But when the interest is down near zero, I guess that gets a lot easier, doesn't it?
Exactly. But it's just not healthy. And look, I'm for absolutely a double dose of generosity to help every American through this pandemic. But my own belief is we should be I'm much more on the Larry Summers side of this argument. Let's really focus the assistance on people who need it, not people who are going to save it. I want to focus on people who need it and will spend it. And then at the same time, put our biggest investment in infrastructure, the kind of productivity enhancing technologies and infrastructure that will enable us to grow out of this. That's what the Asian countries have been doing.
So I'm curious about the targeting of the assistance, the ones who need it the most. It's pretty clear, I think, to everybody, that's an awful hard thing to do. I'm not sure we've done it very well so far on the stimulus. Is it possible, or are we following essentially, forgive the expression, a trickle-down theory, that if we pump enough money into the economy, much of which is going to people who already own capital, that it'll make it into the people that really need it the most?
Well, David, I think there is an argument for that. I know it's not easy, although a lot of people have a lot of ideas on this, through earned income tax credit and whatnot. I'm not an expert on that. All I know is the reason the column is called Socialism for the Rich is that when you inject this much capital into the system, basically you end up suppressing interest rates artificially and therefore inflating financial assets. And if you are an American who has stocks and bonds in your portfolio, a few, a medium, or a lot, you've had actually a great pandemic if you just sat on them. And that's what ends up being socialism for the rich. Capitalism for the poor is that you've got to go out and live on your salary in the middle of a pandemic. And for a lot of people, that's meant no salary or a real struggle.
Tom, there's been a lot of focus on the job economy, basically. We heard again from the Fed chair, Jay Powell, this week at the Economic Club in New York saying we really need a jobs program nationally. We're something like 9.9 million jobs short of where we were before the pandemic. In the short term, keeping zombie companies alive may help that, right? Because they don't lose their jobs, the company keeps going. What about in the long term, if in fact these are not jobs that are entirely justified by the economics?
Well, the real danger here, David, is that this pandemic has accelerated the digitization of our economy. So we've had like 10 years in 1 year. And so coming out of this, we're going to see massive creative destruction because never have more people had cheap tools of innovation. Okay, never before. Starting with this thing. Okay, never had more people had access to cheap capital, zero interest rates. And never had more people had access to high-powered computing through the cloud. So we're really set up here for massive creative destruction. Think of the jobs that are going to disappear just because of the digitization of everything, whether it's jobs related to real estate or anything else you can imagine. So it'll be a huge churn in the economy. That's actually very, very healthy, but it's going to be very, very destabilizing. And we really got to help people through this process. And we've just lived 10 years in 1 year.
So let me stretch for something that might be a stretch too far and go to international economics, something you know terribly well, you really have written a lot about. We condemn, or criticize at least, China for their state-owned enterprises and the waste involved in state-owned enterprises. Do we have something growing up in the United States that might be a rough equivalent of that? We don't own the companies. The government doesn't own the companies, but it supports the companies. As a result, maybe come to the same end through a somewhat different means.
Well, it's a very legitimate, critique. And, what worries me, David, about the whole discussion is that everything is about how we redivide the pie. And Lord knows we have to redivide the pie better. There's 60% of the country that has not had a raise basically since 1980. That is not politically stable or sustainable. So I'm all for that. But if we don't also talk about growing the pie, how we create more taxpayers, how we get more startups. The entire discussion, if you listen to it, is all about who we take from and give to who. We have to have that discussion. But if we also don't talk about how we grow this pie in an age where everything is being digitized, and what that means is that the half-life of skills is shrinking for everybody, okay? Because the pace of change is so quick. You go into companies now like IBM, they'll tell you, hey, David, we've determined that your job is actually going to expire now in 28 months and 7 days. And 3 of your colleagues are now taking these online courses to get ready for the next job. We need to be talking about that as much as the other. And I'm afraid we're not.
So as we look at corporations, is there a relationship at all between bankruptcies on the one hand, because there were predictions of a lot of bankruptcies that basically haven't come to pass yet, and new startups and new growth on the other, or are they entirely separate one from the other?
No, this is Ruchir Sharma's point that basically when you have all these zombie companies, first of all, they soak up a lot of talent. Just got engineers kind of sitting around. And at the same time, they soak up a lot of capital. And it leaves less room for startups. Now, in the pandemic, there have been a lot of startups, and that historically is the trend in downturns. People look for cheaper new ways to do things. But over the long term, you need to unlock that dead wood, just like in a rainforest, or the reason, or just like in a forest, the reason you have forest fires is that it clears away dead wood and allows for new growth to emerge. And the same is true for capitalism. And we want to do that in a stable way. Very easy for me to say. I'm a columnist of the New York Times. I don't have to live through any of this personally. So I appreciate that. But we've got to find a way to make capitalism work. At the end of the day, jobs come when high IQ risk takers take a chance. That's where Bloomberg came from. It's where Google came from. But it's where the new business down the street came from. You need to be unleashing high IQ risk takers and high energy risk takers. They don't have to be IQ, but people who are ready to take risks. Because what I want are more taxpayers. Okay, I want more taxpayers, not just people who we need to support, and we need to support them, but we want more good jobs, and good jobs come from startups. And we need to be talking about that and incentivizing it and celebrating it more, not just talking about redividing the pie, which we also have to do.
Going beyond the zombie companies, I also wonder if there's a relationship between really low, essentially zero interest rates and concentration. A lot of people are writing about increased concentration. We're saying, why aren't the antitrust authorities doing something about this? Is the monetary policy potentially really supporting more concentration? Because it makes it a lot easier. Cost of capital is almost zero. So a CEO can go out and buy something for almost free.
Now you can buy something for free. You can buy your own stock for free, then inflate the price of your stock. Then that inflates the price of your currency to go out and buy companies for stock. So you watch Facebook. I mean, anything that moves in their ecosystem, they try to buy. And how's the next Facebook going to emerge?
So finally, and I'm sorry to save this for last, advise President Biden as he comes to office on foreign policy. What's the biggest problem he's got?
The biggest problem he has, David, is domestic policy. A strong America will have allies in the world. A strong America will be respected in the world. A strong America will be taken serious and have weight in the world. But without a strong America, that is a country that is united at home with an economy growing, you can talk whatever you want about foreign policy, but it's all about leverage. And we will have no leverage if we are divided at home and economically frail.
Which may mean we should be rooting for the dollar, because a strong economy probably means a stronger dollar.
I'm all for it.
Okay, thank you so much. It's really such a treat to get to talk to you. That is New York Times columnist and Pulitzer Prize winner by 3 times, Thomas Friedman. And a programming note now, Wall Street Week airs tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Larry Summers, Afsani Beshlos, Steve Ratner among the guests. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Warren Buffett has been the gold standard for investing for many years now. But now some new players are aspiring to take over that mantle. Our colleague Eric Schatzker talked with one of them. He's Social Capital founder and CEO Chamath Palihapitiya.
I do want to have a Berkshire-like instrument that is all things, not to sound egotistical, but all things Chamath, all things social capital. Look, I was the one that backed up the truck in 2012 on Bitcoin, 2014 and 15 in Amazon, 2015 in Tesla. These SPACs are doing well. I can be a little judgmental at times, but I'm a good decision maker. And I think I know where the world's roughly going. And I want to translate that. I've made enough money for myself. It doesn't really float my boat. I do it as a demarcation of success and to keep the pressure on. But the best pressure for me was if I, was an instrument that retail, normal, ordinary folks could use to close the inequality gap for themselves.
One of the things Buffett did was effectively hold forever. Right? Put his permanent capital to work and almost never sold. Is that you as well? Is the money that you have in, whether it's Virgin Galactic or Clover Health or Open Door or SoFi, permanent capital that you're never taking out?
Yes, but with an asterisk. Buffett became a billionaire at 58. I, because of Facebook, quite honestly, got extremely lucky in my early 30s. But this last decade has been training. And, these last few years now, I'm really on the field. I got my pads on, and I feel like I can play as good as anybody else. But the reality is all of the things I want to do vastly outweighs the capital that I have. Probably I'm, running $10+ billion, 10, 15 billion. I don't know the exact number, to be completely honest, I should. But I am risk on. And I am moving a lot of balls down the field, myself and my team.
And you can see more of that interview with Chamath Palihapitiya on Bloomberg's Front Row. That will be airing tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Coming up, we hear from the second highest-ranking Democrat in the Senate. He is Senator Dick Durbin about the prospects for convicting President Trump and what happens if by any chance he is not convicted. Is there a plan B for the Democrats? We'll be talking with Dick Durbin. That's coming up next on Balance of Power, and we are on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Terrible riot, January 6th. Will demonstrate that, to the contrary, violence and looting goes against the law and order message he conveyed.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Karina Mitchell.
David, thank you. The City of London has little to celebrate after 6 weeks of freedom from the European Union. The financial center lost its crown to Amsterdam as Europe's top marketplace to buy and sell stock. Traders have shifted interest rate swaps out of the city, and relocations of bankers are set to continue in 2021. Still, London's backers insist it will flourish as a financial hub. Meanwhile, former Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihiro Mori has resigned as head of the Tokyo Olympics Organizing Committee. Mori made sexist remarks and added further troubles to the Tokyo Games. That led to criticism from the International Olympic Committee and sponsors such as Toyota. And in Miami, Mayor Francis Suarez has proposed paying city workers and collecting taxes in Bitcoin. Miami is also exploring investing funds in the world's largest cryptocurrency. Suarez has been courting Silicon Valley investors and technology companies, and he thinks adopting Bitcoin is a critical part of that plan. And House Democrats spent 3 days trying to show why Donald Trump should be convicted over the storming of the U.S. Capitol. Now it's time for Mr. Trump's lawyers to make his case. They say they'll need only 4 hours or less. One of the former president's lawyers dismissed the Democrats' video-heavy presentation. He accused them of using it for entertainment value. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Karina Mitchell. This is Bloomberg. David.
Thank you so much, Karina. As Karina just reported to us, we moved to the defense side in the impeachment trial today. Yesterday, we talked with Democratic Senator Dick Durbin, the Majority Whip, when he stepped out of the trial during a short recess. And we asked him whether he agreed with President Biden that some Republican senators just might be changing their minds.
I really don't see that kind of commitment on the other side. Luckily, we had one senator join us, Senator Cassidy from Louisiana, who brought the number to 6 that apparently have seriously considered the impeachment. But of course, we need 11 more.
Are there discussions? Give us a sense of how it works as practice. Do you talk with fellow senators on the break, on the recess, to get a sense of where they're leaning?
Frankly, no. I think this is such a personal question for each and every one of us. And I know that those on the other side particularly are weighing a lot of circumstances in their own lives and their own political careers before they make this decision. I don't think it's a question where a Democratic senator coming in with a persuasive argument is going to make the difference.
This is so different from any other impeachment I could think of. In this sense, the jurors are also witnesses. I mean, this happened to you. The people sitting in that room experienced this. Is that influencing people as they watch this unfold?
It is in this respect. It's not only that we're eyewitnesses, but we are meeting in a crime scene. It was the Senate chamber that was invaded by this terrorist mob. I think what this last 2 days have done is to really open our eyes to the full scope of what happened. We saw just a small part of it, the part that affected us personally. We've seen snippets of videotapes here and there. But what the House managers have done is put it all together into a story with a timeline so that we can understand what happened and what the reactions were. It really helped to give us perspective.
I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here, but right now, the way it looks, it's probably not going to happen. There's a conviction. Assuming for the moment that's what happens, is there a plan B for the Democrats? Is there another way to hold President Trump to account in some way, shape, or form?
There are other ways of doing it, but no one is seriously discussing it until we deal with impeachment. That is our first constitutional responsibility. But God forbid, when this is all over, if we fail the 67 votes and Donald Trump announces that he's been exonerated and his group is reformed into some other force that is capable of the same sort of violence and mischief, you know, we will have failed the American people if we don't bring this kind of violence to a head and stop it.
So you are yourself an experienced lawyer, and you have a sense of the larger scope here of what's going on. As I look back through other impeachments, I'm hard-pressed to find another one in which the President of the United States really, in a sense, is alleged to have attacked another branch of government. That is historic in its own way. What could put it in a larger sense of history? How will history judge us on how we handle this situation?
That is a key question. Every single member of Congress has to answer that question. What if Donald Trump is not impeached? What if no action is taken by the Senate? What have you said about January 6th? What have you said about a mob that came and attacked the Capitol and killed a policeman who was trying to defend you, and violent conduct all around, and others who died in the process? What did you say about that? What did you do about that? You threw up your hands and said, well, we just can't do anything? If we can't do anything to stop someone who's trying a violent overthrow of our government, shame on us.
If you can put yourself in the shoes of some of your fellow senators who are Republicans, how are they processing that? I mean, how do they deal with that? There can't be anyone, I don't think, on the Republican side who thinks this was an okay thing. They must think this is an awful thing. Do they separate Donald Trump, the president, the man, from what happened?
So let me say there'll be some who will use procedural arguments, some will use substantive arguments. I leave it to them, and they are the only ones who can truly answer that question. But I'll tell you what I think. I think many of them are loyal to Donald Trump even to this day, despite what he might have said about them or their families in the past. And more of them are afraid of Donald Trump's political power. He collected millions of dollars after the election to continue to be a political force. Many of them fear that if they vote for impeachment, they can't go home to a town meeting and they don't have much of a chance in the future Republican primary. It's a tough, hard calculation, harder politically than it is on the Democratic side.
Again, as a lawyer, you know the 14th Amendment actually has a provision in there about not being able to run for public office if you've been in part of an insurrection, essentially. Going back to the Civil War, it really goes back to. And again, I know the question right now is conviction and impeachment, but is there thought, or do you have a view as to whether the 14th Amendment might actually limit Donald Trump from running again?
Well, we've talked about that, but there has to be a finding that he was guilty of insurrection or aiding and abetting an uprising against our government. So the Constitution makes that statement in the 14th Amendment, but does not spell out how that's determined. It's not in a court of law. It doesn't say that it's in Congress that that determination is made. But I've heard that argument, and I've raised that same question.
What about censure?
Well, censure is a possibility. I would certainly, if we fall short of impeachment, rather we do censure than nothing. But those who think that that is going to be an easy way out, I think part of the impeachment process that is important here is to make certain that Donald Trump never, ever qualifies or is considered for public office again.
Well, and to that point, as you described, perhaps what some Republican senators are thinking, that they really are respecting or even fearing the continued power of Donald J. Trump. What does that say about the risk of his really participating in politics going forward? That suggests that he has a lot of support across the country.
He won more than 70 million votes on November the 3rd. He needs to be taken seriously, although that support has waned because of January 6th and what has happened since. He is a potent political force. Currently, he is the owner-in-chief of the Republican Party. There's no one else. And I would say that he should be considered a serious possible political force in the future, either personally or through his candidates.
You are not only an astute lawyer, you're also obviously a very astute politician. As you look at the political party on the other side, the Republicans, do you see possible leadership coming forward? Certainly you saw Liz Cheney, who's taken, I think, a fairly bold and really heroic stand.
Well, I can tell you that it's hard for people to believe that as a lifelong Democrat, I'm going to say this, but I sincerely hope that the Republican Party that I knew in the state of Illinois and across the nation can find new leadership and can go back to their roots, which really go back to Abraham Lincoln's day in terms of where they've come from. It's important. I don't think they'll ever reach their goal of being a major political party under the leadership of Donald Trump.
That was part of my interview with Senate Majority Whip Dick Durbin. Coming up, Richard Trumka, AFL-CIO President, on calls for a national program to restore jobs. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Pressure is mounting to get kids back into the classroom, and the CDC is scheduled to release new guidelines just over an hour from right now about that return to the classroom. We spoke with former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers yesterday, and he said the teachers' unions just may need to consider changing their position.
Teacher union interests that have resisted going back to school have really been putting their own material benefit ahead of the interests of their kids. And that is not the best tradition of the teaching profession. Some cases, they're absolutely right to be focused on what's necessary before we move forward. But I'd sure like to see a much more collaborative spirit between teachers and school districts to get people back to school.
We welcome now Richard Trumka. He's president of the 12.5 million member AFL-CIO. So, Richard, great to have you back with us. You heard Larry say, in fairness, they need to be concerned with safety, but the teachers' unions, at least some of them, may have gone too far. Does he have a point?
First of all, I think Larry missed the point completely. Look, educators, David, are asking for 5 or 6 basic things. They're asking for a metric for community infection rates that'll trigger for temporary closures if they go up. They're asking for rigorous testing infrastructure. They're asking for a vaccine schedule. Now, they're not saying vaccines are a prerequisite, but they're saying they're a priority. And if we don't have all the mitigation, ventilation, PPE and everything, then they become increasingly essential. And then, of course, adequate cleaning and ventilation, masks and PPE and social distancing. And the last thing is accommodations for people who are at high risk or care for someone who is at high risk. Because, David, this is a very complex situation. And those at high risk or taking care of people at high risk really do need to have special attention paid to them. So they're working together. You know, they've come to agreements in Chicago and Boston and New York and San Francisco. They're making considerable progress in Philadelphia. They are working together, but those basics have to be in place.
The Federal Reserve Chair, Jay Powell, I'm sure you were paying attention today at an event here in New York at the Economic Club in New York, said that he is really concerned about the job situation, something you raise with us pretty much every week. The 9.9 million people that are out of jobs that weren't before the pandemic. He called for maybe a federal jobs program, a national jobs program. Is that plausible, and what would it look like?
Well, it's not only plausible. I think President Biden's already proposed two. One jobs program, if you will, is contained in his rescue package, and one in the reform package where we're talking about infrastructure. If we start doing infrastructure, that's a gigantic jobs program. If we start addressing climate crisis, that can be a very, very important job creator if we do it the right way. Look, the clean energy economy, first of all, has to be built on family supporting union jobs. And I think the president's made that clear. But in both of those, in his rescue package and in the reform package or recovery package, both of those are jobs packages, David.
Well, so let's talk about that just for a moment, because we've talked before, and you said that you can sort of retrain some of the union workers from fossil fuel jobs and put them over in the climate jobs. What about this Keystone XL Pipeline? Because you took issue with President Biden when he said that, in fact, he was going to shut that down.
Yeah, I did. I disagreed with, the basic decision, although it didn't come as a surprise to us because we knew he was going to do it. He promised to do that. But I also thought he did it the wrong way, because I thought he should have paired that with job creation. And then he did, because just a few days later, he issued an executive order and he started fulfilling his commitment to address the climate crisis with the urgency it demands, while placing the needs of working people and communities at the center of every effort. Look, it's critical that we create good jobs in advance of any action that cause reductions in employment in fossil fuel production and use areas. Working families and communities want to know, and they quite frankly deserve to know, that doing what's necessary to fight climate change won't result in rampant unemployment or a reduced standard of living for them and their families. And so what his executive order made clear is that he understands both of those, and he's going to do them simultaneously. We deeply appreciate his call to invest in coal and other fossil fuel communities to create good jobs in new industries, and by cleaning up abandoned mines and wells, those can create literally hundreds of thousands of jobs, and they can be good paying jobs if they're union jobs. Because what we can't do, David, is take down an industry that pays a very, very good wage with good benefits and replace it with an industry that pays 1/3 the wages and none of the benefits. Because all you do there is create another problem for the one you're trying to solve and create a permanent underclass and poverty-riven area, and increase inequality. None of those things are good for the economy, and none of those things are sustainable in the long run.
Richard, we have a very specific case in the Keystone XL Pipeline. Take us through that. Part of the problem is that there were a lot of union jobs that would have been created by that pipeline that now will not get created. Can you take literally the people, by and large, that would have had those jobs, retrain them, and put them into other jobs? Are we looking at that sort of one-for-one transference?
Well, in many cases, David, you don't even have to retrain them. People that run equipment can run equipment reclaiming mines and old wells, doing other stuff. So you can do that very, very simply. What you have to do is have the money and the resources committed by Congress to actually clean up those areas and create those jobs. Because you can't say, I'm going to take your job on the promise that you may get one a couple of years down the road. The people that do pipeline work can do reclamation work. They can fix leaks and seeps. They can do a number of the things that need to be done in this country to upgrade our infrastructure and improve the quality of our climate, or environment. And so some of those just transfer right over, particularly if the money's there to do mine reclamation and jobs like that in the area.
So, Richard, finally, you've been a big supporter of President Trump. You've done him a lot of good. Is he going to return the favor by basically taking away one of your economists? There's talk about Mr. Spriggs going over to the Federal Reserve.
Well, first of all, I think you were talking about President Biden.
Oh, did I say President Trump? I beg your pardon. President Biden.
You said I've been a big supporter of President Trump.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean that.
Not quite right. Well, look, I don't know. I don't know about any of the rumors, but here's what I do know. If they take Bill Spriggs and they put him on a federal board of governors, he's more than qualified. And two, the federal board of governors will have a worker's voice there that they sorely need. They need to understand how their decisions actually impact people at the community level and at the grassroots level. Bill Spriggs would bring that voice to that organization, to the Board of Governors, and make it far more effective and far more representative of America. Whether it happens or not, it's a decision of the president. And if he should choose Bill Spriggs, I would gleefully tell Bill to do the best he can in service of his country and in service of this administration.
Okay, Richard, thank you so very much. I want to make sure at least I get your name right. That is President Richard Trumka of the AFL-CIO. Coming up, a Bloomberg News investigative report on threats to U.S. computer systems from the Chinese. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. In 2018, a Bloomberg report caused quite a stir, laying out Chinese penetration of U.S. high-tech infrastructure. Today, Bloomberg Businessweek followed up on its earlier reporting, recounting how the threat goes back further in time and may be more extensive than was thought. We welcome now one of the two reporters on the piece. He is Michael Riley, Bloomberg cybersecurity czar. Quite a title there, Mike. So Mike, take us through, if you can, what this adds to what we knew from 2018.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, I think what this story does is really look at this, really sort of present and concerning question of the moment about computer security and cybersecurity, which is like how really sophisticated actors like China or in other cases, in the SolarWinds case, Russia, are infiltrating supply chain networks so that your computer or your server comes into your network already compromised. And therefore, you basically have no chance of detecting loss of data or other things. So what we did is we looked at a single company, Supermicrocomputer Inc., which, although not hugely known if you're not somehow in the cloud business, is a really important maker of computer hardware. It makes servers. More importantly, it makes a lot of motherboards that go into many, many different things, from MRI machines to cybersecurity devices. And we looked at the way that China sort of manipulated the technology of this company. Keep in mind, this is a Silicon Valley company. This is an American company. We looked at the way that China manipulated the technology of this company going all the way back to 2010 and in a series of very sophisticated campaigns. One is like it managed to manipulate code inside the BIOS chip, which is, a particular chip that controls how the machine starts up. Another one was an attack where chips were embedded in motherboards of servers back in factories in China. Another one was, and this one is like the most reminiscent of the SolarWinds hack, how a very sophisticated Chinese hacking group managed to manipulate the update site. It's basically the site that this company sets up for its customers to get trusted updates. But along with some of those updates, and in this case, the case we highlight in the story, impacted Intel Corp,
came malware. But the fact that it comes from a trusted supplier meant that it's very, very hard to detect this kind of stuff. So it basically shines this focus. And if you sort of take it in the context of SolarWinds, where the Russians did something very similar with a different kind of a software company in Texas, like you get a picture of how really hard this problem is to solve.
Right, and just to be precise, this super microcomputer, there's no allegation in the reporting that they knew what was going on. In fact, they denied that it happened. Let me ask you, the reporting from 2018 caused quite a stir at the time. People denied it. I think that maybe even Tim Cook demanded a retraction. Did anybody else match that reporting at the time?
So the 2018 report sort of stood on its own. And you're right, the U.S. government, many different agencies, many different companies said, like, we don't know what this is about. So what we did is we dug in because we knew the story was accurate and we knew that what the sourcing was. So we dug in to try and figure out what exactly is going on here. Right. And what we discovered was it was almost an iceberg under the tip. It was a much larger campaign of manipulation that was being tracked by the U.S. government all the way back to a 2010 incident where the Pentagon found manipulated super microservers in its network. But it's kept under this veil of secrecy because these are counterintelligence investigations.
Mike, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. We have a redhead breaking right now. The FTC is investigating concerns over Nvidia's acquisition of ARM, and Google, Microsoft, and Qualcomm are objecting to the acquisition. They will report more on that as it develops. This is Bloomberg.